Well, good morning, everyone, from one inspiring conversation to another. My name is Dr. Michelle McMurray Heath, and I'm the President and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. We're an advocacy coalition of nearly 1,000 biotech companies spanning food and agriculture, energy and environment, and most importantly for this audience, biopharma. So I'm joined here today by two very influential individuals. We're here with Sir Andrew Witty, the CEO of United Health Group, and Francis D'Souza, the CEO of our host, Illumina. Thank you for joining me. As we all in this room know, this has been the elusive holy grail, being able to use genomics to really unlock and pinpoint which patients are going to respond to treatment and how well they will respond. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how this entire collaboration got off the ground. So Francis, maybe you can start by telling us a little bit about it.
Yeah, it's sort of there's an interesting background here. You know, we as a company have, been dedicated to the mission of improving human health by unlocking the power of the genome. So although the first 10 years of our life was about research, we always knew that to achieve this mission, ultimately it had to be the interaction between a physician and a patient. And so we always had our eye to the clinic. And as the first clinical test started to emerge about maybe 10 years ago, we then turned our attention to say, how do you get these tests adopted? And obviously, reimbursement and coverage is an important part of that equation. And so, we started working with the payers, and we'd been working with United Healthcare for many years. But what changed was when Sir Andrew started, we had a meeting between us, and we had a bunch of activities between our companies. There were a number of areas we were working together on studies for evidence generation, clinical utility. And after listening for a while, Sir Andrew stopped and said, look, given who we are, between United Healthcare and Illumina, we need to do big things. And he said, we need to find something that's so big it can be seen from space. And that was the challenge. And so we started to think about, you're right, what could we do big? And so that led us down the path of creating this collaboration between us, where we are going to pick a few big areas to really dive deep on, to say, what would it take to really accelerate the adoption of these tests in the clinic, or to get the data that says, no, this isn't the right one, let's go look for another one. But get to that answer more quickly. And so that was sort of the genesis for going from working together on a lot of things to creating a formal collaboration and tackling some of the bigger challenges.
So, Sir Andrew Witty, this has been an incredibly complex topic for a long time, particularly coverage of tests and when are tests useful. We've seen this complexity during the pandemic, but in the genomic space, it's even more complex. How are you seeing it from your point of view?
Well, so I think from our perspective, we spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year on genetic and genomic testing. But we're super frustrated, I think, in terms of trying to figure out which are the right tests and how do we get the right value impact into the system. So, and one of the reasons why I was so keen to extend the relationship between United and Illumina was actually it's time to resolve this. We've been at this for 20 years. We've got a huge amount of activity, a huge amount of information and scientific advancement, but we kind of now need to get to the applied or the application of all of this to the benefit of patients and the system. And it felt to me as if there's a moment where we could jointly contribute to the acceleration here. So I'm very focused on let's get the use cases, let's get the really clear evidence of with this information we will do these things differently in the health system. That I think can then inform guidelines, it can inform the way physicians start to risk stratify their patients. I think it can sit incredibly coherently within a reformed incentive system. If you look at the way we at United are trying to encourage management of patients, so much more holistically, much more thinking about the overall outcome for the patient, really, if you think about delegated risk, really asking the physician to think about everything to do with the patient over their lifetime, not just one intervention. That speaks to getting in front of disease. It speaks to understanding the whole risk profile of the patient, figuring out who really needs to be treated now versus tomorrow. And within that, the hope is that genomic and understanding of genomics is going to be a big lever. what's key, I think, is we've just got to bring the insight to certainty as quickly as possible, right? So it just feels like, okay, there's enough in the system for us to start to get traction on. I think working together, we have an opportunity to do that.
So I hear you both saying we might be able to someday soon move from reactive practice of medicine to more proactive. But maybe you can give us a little bit more background on how this work is going to unlock that next step.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think the promise here is that we can move from a healthcare approach that is reactive and expensive and focuses on disease management rather than health management to a world where we are more proactive about healthcare, where we can get better outcomes because we intervene early and not only improve outcomes but do it at a lower cost. Imagine a world where there are no 5 to 7 year diagnostic odysseys for people who have genetic diseases because they can get tested within days of birth and then use that as the blueprint for their life. Imagine a world where you can take a drug knowing it's the right drug for you and that it won't kill you potentially, right? So what we want to do is figure out how we make the genome sort of fundamental to that journey of lifetime health management, and what a terrific place to be, because better outcomes, lower costs, better healthcare provider experience. And so what we want to do is tackle together some of the big questions that are in the way from here to there, right? So can we demonstrate the utility, for example, of using genomics in cancer treatment, for example, around using the comprehensive genomic profiles? Everybody with a tumor, we'd love to get to a place where we have the evidence, the clinical utility, the economic analysis to move the system to say, okay, we've got the data now, either it's not what you need or it is, and let's now accelerate adoption. Or the open questions in the industry still around things like pharmacogenomic profiles. There's enough there to think that this is something we should accelerate, but what we want to do is think about what are the studies, what's the state of evidence in the world today around this? What are the gaps? What studies can we design to address those gaps? And so we're looking at whether it's that or whole genome sequencing, whether it's for babies in the NICU or for all people with genetic disease. So we're identifying some of the big high impact areas where there's enough there to think that genomics could make a really big difference, but now let's get the definitive data to move the state of healthcare forward.
So if I try to read between those lines, it sounds like a mix of kind of long-term studies where you're going to be seeing how whole genome sequencing is really going to predict the course of a patient's life, to very specific short-term studies around like tumor typing. Am I going along the right lines?
Absolutely.
Give us a little more detail.
It's going to be a mix of those, right? So we're going to pick between us, and we've already have a number underway, but we're going to pick maybe 6 or 7 areas, and it'll be a mix of some where we believe if we get the data and it shows what we think it'll show, that there's an impact to be had right now, because the tests exist, the therapies exist, and so, but there'll be some where we think, let's take the time, because if we do this, it could be fundamentally transforming. For example, when we think about pharmacogenomics, we can do it in one of 2 ways. We can do it in drug by drug, or we can start to think about, is there a way to make it, foundational to all the drugs you're going to take in the future? And so we're going to try to think about how do we tackle that? What study would you need if you were doing it drug by drug? What studies would you need? What studies would you need so you can lay the groundwork where it could be foundational for other future drugs? So it's going to be that mix. We want, we maybe want to try and be a little short in patience on some things, to say some things need to happen now.
Right.
But some things we're going to take the long view and say if we do the work, it sets us up well for the future.
Wonderful. So Andrew, how are you looking at how this might change the way United Healthcare really thinks about the application of tests? Are you going to change practices tomorrow or next year, or is this more of a long-term strategy?
I think the answer to that depends on how quickly we get kind of proof and confidence around different insights and what we can do with it. So I think in the short term, one of the big opportunities is to continue to develop better genomic understanding, and also to understand how, alongside phenotypic data, we can really get a comprehensive view of patient opportunity, and again, around risk stratifications. If you think about population health, really making sure you understand within that population where to prioritize your energy today versus tomorrow is a key insight that we think physicians and physician organizations need to continue to strengthen and have help around. My guess is this is a sort of 2 to 5 years out type of impact rather than a tomorrow impact, because I still think there's quite a bit of evidence to be generated. And at the moment, and this again is why we've got a lot of energy about trying to bring this to fruition and to life. It feels like we have tools, we're just not quite sure what those tools are. And I mean that in the sense of what really is a physician going to do differently in the practice once they have that insight, and can they totally rely on that insight? And it feels like we're tantalizingly close, and rather than just let it go in the normal course, we want to accelerate that insight. We want to get to that quickly, because there's no question if we were able, and I've been struck over my career in healthcare, how many times in healthcare, think about oncology, how many times people have said, this is the marker you should prioritize, and then 2 years later we find there's a sub-marker of the marker, and then there's a sub-marker of the sub-marker, and then and you actually continuously re-educate yourself that biology is super complex. It's this ever-revealing onion of precision. Maybe this is maybe this is as close as we're going to get to the ultimate predictive precision. Well, if it is, let's do it, and not take another 20 years. Just let in natural forces, take us. They'll stumble into it. Let's get serious about making progress. And I think from our perspective, very large numbers of patients under our care, very large number of physicians looking for ways to modernize the way they deliver care, an incentive system which really speaks to get preventative, right? Get in front of these diseases instead of chasing them all of the time. I think a compassionate lens which says, why on earth are people being sent on 7-year journeys to discover what's wrong with their kids? Can't we make that happen in a week? You could see that from space.
Right.
And we should be doing stuff like that. And the key, I don't think we're quite there, but we could be there. And that's why we're trying to do all this stuff together.
It calls to mind as well, we're going to need a shift in payment models too. I know a lot of our member companies, and I know, Surendra, you worked at GSK as well, have been thinking about, as you get to more targeted and targeted therapies, maybe there's models like money-back guarantees.
Yeah.
Maybe there's more, so you're actually reimbursing for the innovation, but only in the cases where it's specifically targeted. Using both of your previous hats, how do you think about those payments?
I believed, and I was very outspoken in the pharmaceutical world, that I think that's a direction of travel for many drug types, and I think actually it's a mechanism to relieve some of the tension that exists in the environment around drug pricing and the need to incent innovation, because we need those drugs developed. And I think from where I sit today, it fits super naturally. So, we like very much a model where we're looking at the whole person, not just that one disease, but the whole, because, now, unfortunately, tons of people have 5, 6 comorbidities.
Right.
You can't just look at them as an asthmatic, because they may very well be also a diabetic and also have heart failure. So how do we think about the whole patient, whole human? How do we then make sure that within that we are deploying the right resources to get the very best lifetime outcome? So this idea of one disease, 1 year at a time, which I think in a way has characterized historical incentive systems, is really unhelpful. I think we've got to think about the whole person over their lifetime.
Right.
Then you start to talk much more the language, and what we see is much more focus on the people who need the focus, the sickest, the most complex patients. We see much more focus on prevention versus chasing symptoms, and we see higher rates of adoption of innovation versus not. It's super interesting how that kind of model of financial incentivization changes the way people operate. I don't think we have it perfect, but it creates a really interesting, fertile home for things like genomics. So if you said to me, look, in that model, is it easy to conceptualize how genomic testing or polygenic risk scores might find a home? It would be completely logical to invest in a polygenic risk score if you believed it was going to be predictive of helping you risk stratify that patient group and to get on top of things more quickly. It would fit perfectly. And I think then if you had, whether it's money-back guarantees or some type of performance guarantee around the drugs, you could relieve a lot of the sticker shock tension that exists at the moment around drug pricing.
So from that vision of treating the whole patient over the whole lifetime, Francis, we just heard about global health. Can you talk about this in the context of the whole globe? You know, we often think of these sorts of tests as really only for resource-rich settings, but I assume part of your vision is how this reaches every corner of the globe.
Absolutely. I mean, core to our mission is making genomics accessible. I mean, I said yesterday that genomics should not be another tool for the rich and the lucky. And so we are completely dedicated to saying this is for everyone. You know, one of the things we work on, for example, is making genomics tools more accessible by bringing prices down. If you think about, 2007, when we released our first sequencer, the price of sequencing a genome was $150,000 on our machine, and that was a breakthrough. And yesterday, I talked about the $200 genome. So we brought our prices down by over 99+%, and we're not done because we know there's more work to do to make it more accessible. Now, part of it is technology innovation about making the pricing more accessible, making the user interface more accessible, and so on, removing the requirement for a cold chain so you could ship reagents into countries that don't have cold chains. So part of it is technology. But one of the things we realized, 10 years ago was that, it's much more than technology, that to make this more accessible, we had to help the industry, the community, on things like regulatory approvals, things like getting reimbursement. And so we have a terrific market access team that works around the world with countries, with payer systems, and we've helped get reimbursement around the world for over 1 billion people for genomic tests. Now, still a lot more work to do because there are many more tests that need to be covered, and there are many more people that need to be covered. And we do that even though the reality is we don't get reimbursed for any product we sell. It's our customers that get reimbursed for the tests, but we know that what helps move genomics forward and healthcare forward ultimately helps Illumina. So we're really committed to making the technology, the tests accessible around the world. It's also important because not only is it the right thing to do to make it more accessible, it makes business sense to expand the market, but genomics especially, it's really important that you have diversity in the data sets. That in the end, to produce the right drugs, to produce the right diagnostics, you need to make sure that the data sets you're using to create the diagnostics, to create the drugs, reflect the populations you're serving. We've had examples in healthcare where we haven't done that in other areas, and we've ended up with with tools that work great for some parts of the population and not so great, candidly, for other parts of the population. We don't want that to happen in genomics. And so, having genomics be globally accessible, making sure that the data sets are much more representative than they are today, because they are not fully representative today. So we have work to do, but that also sets us up then well for the future so that we're not systemizing that bias into our scheme of medicine going forward.
So I'm going to ask you for a thought exercise following that. So for the 1 billion new people who have access to these tests, is there a subset of tests that you're finding traction in middle income and maybe low income countries? Are there the tests for which there's an immediate action you can take, or is it the more predictive tests? Is it a disease type? What's attractive to those governments about covering your
it's a great question. So a few things are sort of emerging if you look at lower and middle income countries as tests that they would prioritize. And this conversation would have been different 2 years ago, but obviously with COVID now, one of the important applications that now 205 countries around the world are using is using genomics to do pathogen surveillance, to understand what pathogens are in the community, to understand how they're moving within the community, how they're mutating. And so one key application that's sort of risen to the top now is creating this global network for pathogen surveillance. Bill talked about what a priority it is. We know, for example, that if we were able to stop COVID in the first 100 days, we would have averted 98% of the deaths that we've seen so far. And so it's now becoming a priority, and it's a global priority, because what happens in a fish market in one country matters to all of us. And so the global community is stepping forward to say we want to create. So one application is around pathogen surveillance and infectious disease monitoring. But then on a personal level, there are applications like carrier screening for reproductive health, the non-invasive prenatal testing, cancer screening, therapy selection, for cancer, and genetic disease diagnosis. Those are some of the applications that are getting a lot of traction in lower and middle income countries for the same reason that they're gaining traction here.
Interesting. Well, it seems like definitely a revolution that is either just starting or underway. So, Sir Andrew, how are your competitors and colleagues in the coverage space thinking about this? Are you all marching along towards using these tests more comprehensively, or are you being a bit of a maverick here?
I don't think we're being a maverick. I mean, I think that I think most companies in the space are looking at this area with high anticipation and excitement, but a little bit how big is it going to be, and exactly how do we layer this new approach? What exactly is this new approach going to be, and how do we layer it into a super complex healthcare system and get people engaged and traction? I'm kind of struck with how few physicians actually read the Diabetic Association guidelines, right? I mean, even something like that. So now you start to, okay, now let's move into this space. My guess is probably more than 60% of American doctors qualified before the genome was decoded.
Wow.
So what does that mean? It means that it wasn't part of their core curricula of learning everything. Now, of course, physicians, super bright, they're going to learn, but somebody's going to have to bring all of that. And if you're not a physician who's deeply specialized in this space, it's a whole new thing to add to the world. So I think there's just a lot of practical reality of how do you confirm what this is and then get it rolled out into the system. I think the other place I'm excited about, and one of the things we've started to build up, and it kind of is the core of part of our relationship with Illumina, is how do we, so Francis and Illumina, they do an amazing job of essentially allowing all of this work to happen through their technology. We hopefully can help bring it to the marketplace, and maybe we can combine it with phenotypic data to even further enrich the insight and the practical utility. One of the things we really rely on are your members, so the bio members. So lots of these small companies, imagine you're a small company with a really cool idea, but you're looking upstream. Where do you start? I mean, where do you start from a regulatory, health economics, reimbursement, get my test, get my insight actually supported? And that's where, for us, we've created our Inside Optum, an organization called the Evidence Engine for Genomics, which is all about helping small companies essentially bring to light, or give them advice and support through that journey. And where one of the most recent extensions of our relationship with Illumina is something we're calling Catalyst, which is a very specific joint effort where we're essentially coming together and say, look, if you've got a cool idea as a small company and you want to bring to life this insight, this innovation that you have, then you've got the leader in genomic testing sat here, and you've got the biggest healthcare reimburser in the system sat here, and we're willing to work together to help you get to market and go through the various hurdles that you need to go through. I actually think that's a key piece of all of this, because otherwise we still aren't solving. We've got two issues to solve. The evidence issue we've spent a few minutes talking about, but then we also have to really ensure the innovation pipeline is as diverse and as rich as possible, because that's where all the real value of all of this for patients is going to come from. And I'm super excited about the work we're doing on that particular piece.
Yeah, let me add to that. I mean, that is an incredibly exciting program. So this clinical catalyst approach we're taking, which is to extend this reach to the community, to say, if you are a company, a small company developing a test, reach out to us. And what we'll do is we'll work with you to try and help, gather first understand the landscape, to see what's the gaps in evidence that you have that are blocking you from getting adopted. Then let's help you design the studies, to close those gaps. So there's a terrific example. The first company we're working with, and I believe they're here, is Polaris Genomics. Charles, are you here? If you are, yep, terrific, there you are. Polaris is a fantastic company. It's a vet-owned company, and I think you have Damon and Michael here too. And what they're doing is developing a genomic test to screen and diagnose PTSD. And they're working with the US government around the Mission Daylight Suicide Prevention Grand Challenge, because it's a huge challenge for returning vets with PTSD. And so they've developed a test that can diagnose PTSD more quickly to get the vets the help they need. And so, it's a promising test. And so what we want to do is we'll work together as part of this Clinical Catalyst program to identify, again, what's the evidence needed, to demonstrate both the clinical utility and economic value of that test, and how can we accelerate, going through that study, gathering the evidence, and get to that decision. And so, it's a way we're extending our collaboration into the community.
And this is, sorry.
No, go right.
We're excited about this.
First off, I think it's fantastic that folks are working in this kind of area, because bringing the kind of cutting-edge technology that Polaris and the others are working on, but focusing on an area like PTSD for veterans, I think it's phenomenal, right? And it's not, you don't always hear that. You don't always hear that the leading-edge technology is being deployed into an area like veterans. Right. And I just want to really applaud that focus. Secondly, from our point of view, our OptumServe organization, we manage 3 of the 5 VA regions across the country. Oh. And nothing, again, back to, can we bring the promise of technology, actually understand it, and really figure out how to get applicability in a way which makes an impact, positive impact for people? Mm-hmm. For us, this lines up super well for us in terms of the people we try and serve every single day, the servicemen and women of the US who've done everything for this country, and we need to do as much as we can for them. Being able to bring this kind of innovation into that world is super important.
And it's a world where scale matters, and both Illumina has scale and United Health has scale. How many lives are covered in this collaboration? How many millions of lives do you have access to?
Well, so this particular collaboration is really an effort to help Polaris understand the space and to work through and take time out of the process. Mm-hmm. Figure out whether it's going to work, and then take time out of the process. I mean, in terms of we cover about 45 million lives in the US. From an insurance point of view, we treat nearly 30 million people in our primary care clinics, and we have a direct relationship with about 140 million Americans through one part of Optum or another, or one part of United Healthcare or another. So our ability to connect, whether that be in the VA, the Medicare, Medicaid, commercial insurance marketplaces, we are looking for ways in which we can improve quality, improve the experience, simplify healthcare, and take cost out of healthcare. Now, I think that one of the big levers to that conundrum of quality, cost, experience, it has to be technology. It has to be technology, because otherwise, otherwise, you're never going to be able to satiate those 3 demands. This is one of those areas where we think this is probably the lead opportunity to really unlock that complex little mix, right? How do we make a leap forward in quality of care? How do we streamline the system for everybody? And how do we take cost out of the system for everybody? This is one of those, and that's why we want to test. We want this experiment done quickly and right, and so we can move forward.
Yeah, and I'll add, 45 million covered lives is a huge, fantastic place to start. But Andrew also may not be pointing out, United is very influential in the sense that if you do these studies right, it helps, make the decision for the 45 million, but it'll have a ripple effect for billions, because people will look at those studies and use that to make their decisions. We learned that, for example, with the fantastic work done at the 100,000 Genome Project with Genomics England, who's here too, that the world looked at what happened there, consumed those studies, and it informed decisions that everyone else was making. And so there's a huge opportunity here to leverage the studies between, all the folks here even, to say, can we learn from each other and piggyback of each other? And so, the work that United does, it really will impact billions of people.
So if we're coming back, and I know we're running out of time, but if we're coming back in 5 years to say one thing that this collaboration has achieved, what would be your top of your wish list?
I think it'll be foundational. The work we do will be foundational to us getting the next billion people covered for genomic testing. We'll go from 1 billion to 2 billion, I hope, in the next 5 years.
I love it. What about for you, Sir Andrew?
I'd like to believe that 5 years from now, this has stimulated a crowdsourcing of others coming into the space, and with a really hard focus around translating the research potential into true clinical impact. And I hope that 5 years from now, we're not talking about what genomics could do, we're talking about what genomics is doing.
I love it. And I'll add my personal wish, which is I hope 5 years from now you've changed the culture of the practice of medicine so that all of those physicians who perhaps trained after sequencing of the genome see it as de rigueur. So thank you so much for this collaboration and can't wait to see what's ahead.
Thank you.